Hey man, I love the channel, but I'm gonna have to apologize in advance for how vague I'm gonna be here because this whole thing already caused a ton of crap for my family and I. I'm talking the kind of crap I wouldn't even wish on my worst enemy. And since I can't have it happening again, I'm gonna try and stay as faceless as possible here. So I was born into a family that had been very lucky when it comes to finances. We've had a bunch of money in the family going back generations, but for the longest time, all I knew was that it came from a forefather being a successful merchant back in covered wagon times. History wasn't my thing growing up, and my family didn't talk about it much either, so I didn't really know squat about it until just after I turned 16. And it all started on a Sunday morning. On my birthday, Dad told me that I could get a learner's permit and he'd buy me a car if I kept my grades up at school. And so I'm still walking on air as I pass Mom on the way to do her little grocery run. She made a joke about how I'd be driving her soon, and I was just like the Cartman in that South Park episode when he's lying on a pile of money just saying, "Yeah," with his big dumb smile on his face. I don't know if you remember that one, but after she left, I walked into the kitchen to make myself some breakfast. And then a minute later, all I heard was her honking her horn, and not just like a quick beep. It was like those long, prolonged, solid blasts. So me, my dad, and my two brothers went running out the door and down the driveway to see what had happened. And at first, I remember being terrified that some kind of freak car accident had killed her. I breathed a huge sigh of relief when I saw that she and her car were fine, but she was standing on the road with the door open, pointing at the wall outside of our house, and with her jaw practically grazing the ground. Because spray painted on the side, and in massive dark red letters, someone had written, "Blood Money Pigs are gonna pay." It was kind of scary at first because, while Blood Money Pigs is a cool name for an industrial metal band, it is not what you want to see spray painted on the wall of your house. But then once we thought about it, we figured it was probably some jealous a-hole wanting to vandalize a nice neighborhood, and we just so happened to be the unlucky house that they chose to dirty up, so to speak. Yet while he wouldn't share anything with us until much later, it wasn't long before my dad started to suspect their choice of target wasn't so random. And that's because after washing and repainting the wall, so it looked good as new, the exact same thing happened maybe 2 to 3 weeks later. Sunday morning, Mom goes on her little grocery run, then brrr, something else had been spray painted on the wall. "Blood on your hands," it said. Now it was clear we were being targeted for some reason because no one else in the neighborhood ever reported any vandalism, but all we could really focus on at the time was why us. Mom was a homemaker and pretty popular with the other moms at school and around the neighborhood too, so it wasn't like she had any serious enemies. And then Dad spent his time running a charitable foundation that, long story short, was financed by the money his investment group made. He worked with sick kids, animal shelters, the homeless, you name it. Anyone who needed the help in, let's just say, the general vicinity, Dad could be counted on to show up with an oversized check for a handshake and a photo. Naturally, he too was a very popular man. So how in the name of all hell did we have blood on our hands? Mom and Dad ended up getting involved, and Dad paid to have some fancy security camera attached to the front gate. But then whoever was vandalizing the wall must have noticed because the first thing they did the next time they showed up was spray the camera lens so it couldn't see them writing, "Kelsey Scum Leave Town," on the outside wall of our house. Now, they didn't just graffiti that time either. These vandals poured a bunch of gas or something over the wall and then set fire to the plants at the side of our driveway, most likely in the hopes that the whole place would catch fire and burn down. Like I said, Dad already had his suspicions regarding why we were being targeted, but it wasn't until the Kelsey incident that he had them confirmed. Yet he still kept Mom and us in the dark, and the meaning behind the Kelsey name was lost in the confusion. And by that I mean none of it made sense, so it's not like the name clicked with us like it did with Dad. He started paying for security to watch the street outside our house, which basically involved a pair of dudes taking turns keeping watch 24/7. And it was one of those security guys that chased off someone who was likely trying to follow us to school in the morning to see which ones me and my brothers went to. And that was the going theory, at least. We didn't have it 100% confirmed, but it was still enough to scare Mom and Dad into moving us out of that house for a while, at least until the cops could figure out what was going on. But like I said, Dad kind of knew what was going on. He just didn't tell our mother until we were safely someplace else. My brothers and I find out a whole other story too, but since it's way longer and takes place years after the graffiti stuff, I'll just write this like you're my mom finding out after we moved. So, sometime in the early 1840s, two of my ancestors made the journey from Kentucky to California. Andrew and Benjamin Kelsey bought cattle rights to a stretch of land near Clear Lake from a Mexican guy who worked with the local Pomo Indians to drive his herds. But when the Kelsey brothers took charge, assisted by a man named Charlie Stone, they weren't nearly as friendly with the Indians as the Mexican was. See, they came from Kentucky, which was a slave state, a place where it was very much a work or die type mentality, and while the Pomo wouldn't work for free, Andrew Kelsey paid wages that his own self would have found straight up insulting. Once they were set up, his brother Ben returned to some ranch they had and left Andrew and Charlie Stone to deal with the Pomo, and deal with them they did. One day, a disagreement between Charlie Stone and a Pomo warrior almost turned violent. Andrew Kelsey managed to defuse the situation and promised the Pomo better treatment, but just before dawn the next morning, he and Charlie rode around with their rifles, confiscating all the Pomo's weaponry at gunpoint. And after that, since the Pomo had no viable means of defending themselves, the two men ramped the mistreatment up to 11 and started cussing out or horsewhipping the Pomo whenever they were working too slow or did something wrong. And this went as well as you might imagine, and ended with the Pomo laying siege to the house Kelsey and Stone had built, which was apparently more like a fortress by that point, as they had an idea that the Pomo might rise up, which is like a whole other level of a-hole, right? Now anyway, it's all going to hell down at Clear Lake, and somehow news of this got to Andrew's brother Ben, who showed up with a posse to chase the Pomo off. And while Ben was definitely exploiting his own band of Pomo back on his own ranch, he wasn't nearly as much of an a-hole as his brother, not at first anyway. To defuse the situation, he promised the Pomo generous pay if they'd hunt down a band of native cattle rustlers who had been bothering him. Turns out these rustlers had been bothering the Pomo too, so not only were they too happy to hunt them down, but they dropped their dispute with Andrew after getting a big pile of cash from Benjamin. And before he left, Benjamin also warned his brother to start treating the Pomo better, or they'd do the same thing and rise up all over again. You think he might have taken his older brother's advice, but Andrew's dumbass went right back to the same old routine and treated those Indians like crap again. With the help of a bunch of ranch hands he hired, Kelsey took the Pomo's weapons away again. But that time, he also took away their fishing gear too, meaning they were entirely reliant on him for all their food and other essentials, and he gave them next to nothing. This went on for a while, and then when a young Pomo boy asked for another cup of wheat to feed a sick mom, Charlie Stone shot him dead on the spot to make an example of him to the others. Having gotten word of how the same pattern of mistreatment was playing out again, Ben Kelsey rode over to his brother's land and hired 50 Pomo men to take part in a gold mining expedition. But after Ben got sick with malaria, the Pomo stayed put and ended up getting picked off one by a combination of malaria and hostile tribes. Ben didn't mean any of them to die, but when word reached their families, they became incredibly angry. And then after a Pomo girl went missing for a few days, they turned up again saying that Andrew had been keeping her prisoner and using her as a love slave, and the crap well and truly, at that point, hit the fan. A Pomo chief snuck into Andrew's gunpowder store before dawn one morning and poured water all over it to make it unusable. And then once the sun came up, a band of warriors attacked Andrew's house with bows and arrows that they'd been making in secret. They took him by complete surprise and had him shot full of arrows before he even had time to react. Charlie Stone ended up shooting down a couple of warriors, and then he tried escaping by jumping out of a window but hurt himself on landing. He tried running, but he obviously couldn't. Then, after easily running him down, and this is according to my dad, the Pomo warriors bashed his head in with a rock as a way of saying that he was too low and dishonorable to be killed with regular weapons. A few weeks later, when Ben Kelsey heard about what happened, he rode down to Andrew's place with a hired posse to recover his body. And that's when the massacre really started, because as they went, they killed every single Pomo Indian they could find. Ben and his boys killed so many of them that on account of all the public outrage, they ended up getting arrested when they returned home. Dad said the case was the first ever to reach the California Supreme Court, but in the end, none of the men were ever tried for anything, and when the army refused to help him drive the Pomo out, Ben Kelsey threatened to take an even bigger posse out there to finish them off himself. In the end, the army sent out a bunch of cavalry to move the Pomo on, but their commander was very sympathetic to Ben's story and had no intention of peacefully moving anybody off the land. When he and his men found the Pomo camp, they found it defenseless, as mostly all of the younger warriors were off on a big deer hunt someplace. They left only 400 Pomo, mostly women, kids, and old people, and the army killed around half of them. The army also killed just less than 100 more Pomo as they rode back to base camp, and while Ben Kelsey didn't directly take part in this, the greater part of the massacre, it can't be said that he didn't have a hand in it. Dad said that the way it was told to him when he was a kid, Ben Kelsey was basically cursed after that. He ended up selling his land in California, then moved the family to Mexico for some time, and then on to Texas, and it was there that, in a weird twist of vengeance, one of his daughters barely survived being violated and scalped by a Comanche warrior when their wagon was attacked. The ordeal scarred her mentally for life, and she was basically kept in the house all the time with no one allowed to see her because the sight of any strange person would send her into wild fits of screaming and crying. And to get away from the place that almost took his daughters from him, Ben moved the whole family back to California, where he got into the mining business. He then spent his twilight years in Los Angeles before dying in his 70s in the 1880s. Benjamin Kelsey had made a ton of money by the time he died, and it was all shared out among his surviving kids, one of whom ended up being my grandpa's grandpa. He invested it wisely, the fortune kept on going, then by the time it was all handed off to my dad, he could afford to create the foundation and basically pay a bunch of people to manage all of his stocks and whatnot for him while still making stupid amounts of money. No, I'm not gloating, I'm just being real, and while I am proud of my dad for being sensible and not blowing the fortune, which does happen a lot, I guess all that money really can be traced back to a single source, which was the Kelsey brother mistreating and massacring the Pomo while making a ton of money in the process. I guess someone figured that out and then traced the family line down right to my dad before deciding that they were going to try and get some late-in-the-game revenge on behalf of the natives. And while I don't condone what they did, I can definitely understand why they were so mad when they read about the massacre, because I sure as hell was too. And as you can probably tell, I've done a lot of research on what the Kelseys did, and I've read a bunch of other books on the wider subject of U.S. Native relations. They vary wildly depending on where you're looking and when, and it's not always so black and white as people on Twitter want you to believe. But in the case of what they call the Bloody Island Massacre, it's clear to me that there were a bunch of Indians living relatively peaceful lives someplace, and then when these 3 American guys showed up, it signaled the doom of hundreds of innocent Native people. And that's just depressing and enraging and shameful in a way that I don't think I can put into words. It's obviously not mine or my dad's fault for what happened in the past, so I don't think we deserve to be targeted for what some guy did almost 200 years ago. But at the same time, I know for certain which charity I'm going to send a bunch of my inheritance to on the day it arrives. And that's the Lucy Moore Foundation, a non-profit organization founded to educate the public about what my ancestors did. It's named after a survivor of the massacre, a 6-year-old girl who hid underwater in the lake and breathed through some kind of hollow reeds so she didn't have to come up for air. And sometimes, I think I'd swap all that money that we got in our family just so she wouldn't have to go through what she did. My name is Marie. I'm from France, and a few years ago, I decided to do some research on my family tree. To be specific, I wanted to know what my ancestors were doing around the time of the French Revolution, and my sister agreed it would be cool to know their story from that time, but strangely, our mother didn't seem nearly as enthusiastic. She kept asking things like, "Why do you care? It was such a long time ago," or "Why are you wasting time on the past when you should be looking for a husband?" In a sense, I understood where she was coming from. I was single at the time, and my mother has always been very vocal about her desire for grandchildren. But I now know her questions were coming from a very different and much darker place in her mind. Tracing my great-grandparents was easy, but from there, things got more and more difficult until I hit a dead end. The earliest relative I could find was a woman named Marie-Louise Pauline Blanc, who died in 1850. Yet for some reason I couldn't find any records detailing the location or date of her birth. She had a few brothers and sisters, including Louise Marie, who died in Paris in 1881. Yet once again there was no information on where or when she was born, only that the first records of her existence in France began in 1834 when she was already a grown woman. Record-keeping from the time is notoriously unreliable or frustratingly incomplete, so at the time, I didn't find anything overly unusual about the absence of information. But then I discovered Marie-Louise and Louise Marie, who I suspected of having a very uncreative mother, had another sibling, a brother named Jean-Pierre Pauline Blanc, who helped me figure out why there was no record of my family in France prior to the 1830s. Because Jean-Pierre hadn't died in France like his sisters. He'd died across the Atlantic, in the storied city of New Orleans. I had no idea my ancestors were colonists, or that at least one of our family had made their way across the ocean to the New World. My sister was excited by the news and bid me to keep up my research. I believed our mother would react with the same kind of indifference, asking why I was bothering to dig up the past when it had no bearing on our present. But to my surprise, when I mentioned that one of our ancestors made his home in the Americas, she acted like I had spoken of raising the dead. She begged me to stop what I was doing and not to dig any further because pain and suffering was all it would bring. And it was then, and only then, that I realized that she knew a lot more than she was telling me. I gave her an ultimatum. Either she told me what she knew about her ancestors, or I'd keep on researching and find out for myself. And then after inviting me over to the house, this is what she told me. Our ancestors had migrated to New Orleans, but had done so via Ireland at the behest of Louis Barthélemy de McCarthy. It's unclear how the Frenchman earned his Irish second name. And there, he and his wife had a daughter they named Marie Delphine, who was born March 19th in 1787. Marie Delphine was just 4 years old when the Haitian Revolution broke out in 1791. Enslaved Haitians cast off the shackles of servitude, and the revolution peaked with the massacre of thousands of French colonists and slave owners whom their former slaves referred to as barbarians. Before the massacre of the French, the colonists punished enslaved rebels by binding them together, loading them onto ships, and then tossing them into the Caribbean Sea to drown. A French general also pioneered a primitive form of a gas chamber, locking hundreds of black prisoners in the holds of these ships and burning sulfur to asphyxiate them en masse. But that's not all. The French imported specialized Cuban bloodhounds trained to track, maul, and eat enslaved Haitians, sometimes holding public spectacles in amphitheaters where prisoners were bound to stakes and torn apart by these dogs for the entertainment of French officers. Yet most offensive to the enslaved were the public crucifixions that captured rebels were subjected to. Seeing their fellow rebels hanging from crosses, burned alive, or broken on Catherine wheels inspired the massacre that would follow. And as stories of the violence made their way to New Orleans, terrified slave owners either improved their slaves' living conditions dramatically or subjected them to even harsher treatments in the hopes that it would break their spirits and reduce the chances of their revolt. In fact, Marie Delphine's uncle had been murdered by his own slaves in 1771, and as a family of slave owners, their solution was to treat their slaves as animals. In June of 1808, a then 21-year-old Marie Delphine married a man named Jean Blanc, a prominent banker, merchant, lawyer, and legislator. At the time of the marriage, Blanc purchased a house at 409 Royal Street for the family, which became known later as the Villa Blanc. Delphine had 4 children by Blanc, one of which was our direct ancestor. But the marriage did not survive, and in June of 1825, it seems Marie had a thing for June weddings. She married her third and final husband, Dr. Leonard Louis Nicholas Lalaurie. After which she went by the name that she would take to her grave, and the one by which she is infamous, Madame Marie Delphine Lalaurie. In 1831, Madame Delphine had a 2-story mansion constructed at 1140 Royal Street, which she managed in her own name and with little involvement of her husband following their eventual separation. She lived there with her children, but the household was maintained by black slaves, and in line with her own family's treatment of their slaves, they were treated abominably. I found mention of Madame Delphine in a book by Harriet Martineau, an Englishwoman who wrote books about sociology, and she mentions that even in a place where black slaves were treated as less than animals, Madame Delphine's slaves were, and I quote, singularly haggard and wretched. This stands in stark contrast with Madame Delphine's public treatment of black people, both free and enslaved, as Martineau noted that she was generally polite to them and seemed to care a great deal about their physical health. Yet official records tell a very different story. Between 1830 and 1834, local funeral registers show that 12 of Madame Delphine's slaves passed away, but the cause of their deaths are not listed. These include a cook named Bonne, listed as a chronic runaway, along with her 4 children. Their deaths caused such an uproar in New Orleans that rumors of grave mistreatment circulated and eventually prompted a visit from a local lawyer who intended to remind Lalaurie of the laws for the upkeep of enslaved people. Yet this lawyer found no evidence to suggest wrongdoing or mistreatment of enslaved peoples by Lalaurie, and the report of his findings seemed to have adequately quelled the rumors, at least for a while anyway. Author Harriet Martineau was still present in New Orleans when one of Madame Lalaurie's slave girls fell from the roof of the Royal Street mansion. An eyewitness said that the 8-year-old girl was attempting to escape punishment and was being pursued at the time by a whip-wielding Madame Lalaurie. It was later discovered that the young girl's name was Leah, and that she'd been brushing Delphine's hair when she hit a snag, angering Lalaurie to the point that she grabbed a whip and started chasing her. The incident led to another investigation whereby Madame Lalaurie was found guilty of illegal cruelties and forced to give up 9 of her slaves. Yet through some horrible twist of fate, these slaves were then brought back by the Lalauries through an intermediary relative and thus returned to the mansion. One such slave, the cook who replaced the deceased Bonne, was chained to the stove and had her children beaten mercilessly whenever she failed to live up to Madame Lalaurie's standards. The situation reached breaking point in April of 1834 when a fire broke out at Lalaurie's mansion. It was later discovered this fire was started by the cook, a 70-year-old woman who was chained to that stove by her ankle and who said she herself had deliberately started the fire rather than face yet another punishment of watching her children being beaten. This cook also claimed that any slaves were taken to the uppermost room, never to come back. Bystanders who witnessed the fire attempted to enter the mansion to ensure everyone had been evacuated, yet it was reported that Madame Lalaurie refused to hand over the keys. In response, these bystanders broke down the mansion's doors, And it was then, while going from room to room and looking for survivors, that they discovered all manners of horror. 7 of the slaves were found hanging by their arms, legs, or necks, with one witness saying their limbs were stretched and torn from one extremity to the other. Another witness was a local judge named Jean-Francois Canonge, who claimed to have seen a black woman forced to wear an iron collar, as well as an older slave woman with a head wound so dire that she could not stand properly. Canonge said that when he questioned LaLaurie's husband about those enslaved on the property, he was told in an insolent manner that some people had better stay at home rather than come to others' houses to dictate laws and meddle with other people's business. When word of Monsieur LaLaurie's most unrighteous indignation spread, a mob of local citizens attacked the Royal Street mansion and, according to one bystander, destroyed everything upon which they could lay their hands. The local sheriff and his officers were called to disperse the crowd, but by the time the mob left, the property had sustained major damage with scarcely anything remaining but the walls. Madame LaLaurie's surviving slaves were taken to a local jail, not because they'd done anything wrong, but because the judge wanted people to see them, so they'd know how they'd been treated and know the evil that Madame LaLaurie had done. The grounds of the mansion were also dug up, and the bodies of several slaves were said to have been exhumed, including that of little Leah, who fell from the roof. People were furious with the LaLaurie family and wanted her hanged, but by that point she had already fled New Orleans for France. The mansion was later rebuilt, and through my own research, I discovered that actor Nicolas Cage had bought the house for a sum of $3.45 million in April of 2007, but the documents were arranged in such a way that Cage's name did not appear on them, and he later sold the property, so he's no longer the owner. Madame LaLaurie lived out the rest of her life in exile in Paris, but missed New Orleans terribly. She actually planned to travel back at one point, but her children convinced her not to, quite rightly saying that she'd probably be killed. Her eventual death in 1849 remains something of a mystery, with some saying that she died in a boar hunting accident, others of natural causes. But what's clear is that even in Paris, she was hated by all who knew what she'd done, and I can count myself among that number. It was very hard for my mother to reveal who our ancestors were. She didn't want me to be burdened with it like she had, but I'm glad she told me. I'm glad I know where I came from, because it's a reminder to be different, and God willing, if I have my own children, I'll raise them to appreciate the value of human life in a way that Madame LaLaurie never did. Growing up, I never knew my paternal grandparents. I was told they died before I was born, but that wasn't entirely true. And it wasn't until my early 20s, when I was finally told this story, that I realized that I had an uncle I'd never met, too. My dad told me the story after he found some pot baggies in my room, kind of like a way of saying, you don't want that life. And boy, did he ever make his point. So, my dad was born at the tail end of the Depression, meaning he, my grandparents, and his siblings grew up in extreme poverty. They ranged in age pretty wildly too, because when my grandpa was still in diapers, his eldest brother was like 18 or 19, that sort of age. And they were so poor that Dad and his siblings sometimes went to bed without any dinner, and when they did eat, it was all Depression-era meals like hard times soup or poor man's pie. Dad said he didn't even get a pair of shoes until he was maybe 6 or 7 years old, and then my grandma and eldest aunt actually shared a pair so my aunt could walk to school and back. It was that kind of hard for them. Not just poor, but dirt poor, you know? And then one day, everything changed. From my dad's perspective, all he noticed was how his ma and pa got real happy all of a sudden, and how the family moved to a much nicer place not longer after they suddenly got happy. They ended up moving to an even bigger place a short while after some big funeral, one that everyone in the county went to, and from then on, things were never the same. Grandma and Grandpa started fighting all the time, then Grandpa and my mysterious uncle got into a big fight too, apparently, and the next morning, Grandpa was gone. just left a note on the table saying he was sorry along with a whole bunch of money. He was never seen again. No one knew if he lived or died or what happened to him. My uncle, the one I never met, had left some time after, but maybe a year later, Grandma got word that he'd been killed in a bar fight out of state. And that's how my dad grew up. His own dad gone by the age of 10 to be raised by a single mom who worked herself into an early grave, making sure her kids wanted for nothing. But before she died, she told him the story of what happened to them, why their lives were suddenly transformed for the better one day and then suddenly destroyed out of nowhere. So one day, back when Dad was around 6, Grandpa came home in a totally different mood than he normally would. He usually came home tired and cranky after a long day of either working or looking for work, but on this occasion, my grandma said that he walked through the door with a spring in his step. He picked her up, spun her around, and told her that in 1 week's time, all their money troubles would be over. When she asked how that could be, Grandpa drew a finger to his lips and said, while he couldn't tell her, his word was his bond. Now, sure enough, 1 week later, Grandpa came home with a bundle of cash after being out all night with my uncle, and so began the good life for my dad and his family. But something happened around that time that didn't pass Grandma by, and she took to wondering just how exactly Grandpa had laid his hands on all that cash. You see, the same morning Dad came home with his money, a local farmer was found murdered outside his home. There was a big hoopla about it, and this farmer was a holdout, refusing to sell to this big land baron who wanted to turn his fields into a grazing space. He was offered larger and larger amounts to vacate his land, but he refused every time. All he wanted was to farm his land just like his pa did before him, and then hand it all off to his son once he was reunited with the Lord. That old land baron vowed to get the farmer's land by hook or by crook, so when he was found stabbed to death in the early morning, folks were obviously outraged, and they suspected the baron. Nothing came of it. All the baron's boys had alibis and what have you, so the sheriff suspected outside involvement, like a man for hire. Grandma was so worried that she actually confronted Grandpa about the money and demanded he finally tell her where he got it from. She's always assumed it was from running moonshine since that was still a big thing at the time, but after the farmer's murder, she got to wondering and worrying, enough to ask him to his face, but Grandpa swore he had no part of it. He swore on the Bible that he'd made that money moonshining and that never in his wildest dreams would he kill another man, and a good man at that, for nothing but a pile of blood money. Grandma said she was reassured, but she still never fully lost her suspicions. The timing was too right, and the pile of money seemed way too big for just a single moonshine run, but since he made his case well enough, she didn't question it out loud again. Not until a couple of months later when the farmer's son showed up dead. It looked like nothing more than a terrible accident. The farmer's boy was riding on his horse one night when something like a rattlesnake gave him a scare. The horse bucked him, he fell off, then broke his neck. Simple as that. A lot of people bought it and said how sometimes it's a case of bad things happening to good people, but not everyone saw it for what it was, and as far as I'm concerned, they were right not to. Because the morning after the farmer's boy fell from his horse and broke his neck, my grandpa came home with yet another pile of money. The farmer's boy had actually been set to sell his parcel of land off to the baron, and at a very fair price too from what Grandma heard. But then right at the last minute, he changed his mind and refused to sell, saying he wanted to honor his dad's wishes. Tradition still means something around here, so everyone celebrated the decision, and that's not even a month or two later, and what do you know? But the farmer's boy has an accident. There was no investigation that time, and since the farmer's widow couldn't handle the day-to-day, she opted to sell it all off to the baron, only this time at a much, much lower price. There was another big funeral again, and like I said, another big pile of money. But since Grandma had been talking about a moonshine run for weeks in advance, she didn't think much of the timing. Or at least she tried not to think much about it, because the more she did, the more it ate at her. But then over time it got harder and harder not to think about it on account of the way my grandpa and uncle were acting. Part of the reason she was able to forget as much as she did after that first quote-unquote moonshine run was how grandpa and uncle acted. They weren't acting like they'd done anything wrong. They were drinking to celebrate, and they were very happy with the family's newfound wealth. But then after the second quote-unquote moonshine run, they were about as opposite as could be. It was like a dark cloud was hanging over each of them. They were surly, they hardly slept at all, and they were either drinking, playing poker, or arguing in hushed voices out on the porch at night. And then one night, after hosting a poker game at the house, the whole situation came to a head. One of the guests made a joke about killing a man over a game of cards, something which my uncle took great offense to. He asked the guest if he knew what it was like to kill a man, and then when the guest said no, scared and confused at my uncle's dark turn, he was told that he should shut his mouth and not joke about such serious things. The situation escalated to the point where my uncle made a not-so-veiled reference to having himself taken a life, and that's when Grandpa exploded. He beat the living hell out of my uncle, right there in front of the poker guests, then dragged him off to the woodshed and locked him inside to sober up. And after that, Grandma confronted her husband for a second time and asked him straight up if he'd gotten all that money from murdering the farmer and son. Grandpa never admitted it, but he broke down in front of her. Then he cried, and he cried, and he cried, for a long, long time, according to Grandma. He was drunk to high heaven, but it wasn't the whiskey that was stopping the words from coming out. Grandpa was just too distraught to speak on whatever was tearing the family apart. She laid him up in bed, tucked him in, then talked him off to sleep. Then Grandma went outside, unlocked the woodshed, and did the same to her boy, who was also in dire need of medical attention too, from what my dad remembered. Now, this meant Grandma didn't get her own self to bed for another couple of hours, and then when she woke up the next morning, sometime after dawn, she noticed my grandpa wasn't lying next to her. She got up to go look for him, and he was gone. And in his place, there was a big pile of money on the table, and a note saying how sorry he was for everything. Grandma pressed my uncle on what he and Grandpa had done, but kept up the lie about moonshining, most probably out of fear for the noose, but also because he was too damn proud to tell the goddamn truth. He ended up running away his own self not long after, but unlike Grandpa, where no one ever heard a word about him and his fate is a total mystery, my uncle ended up dying in a bar fight. Someone caved his head in with a piece of furniture, and I heard they swung for it too. Mom was real sad when they got the news, but she didn't cry at his funeral, not like my dad and his siblings did, because in a sense, her son was dead already. It was just a matter of time before it caught up with him. Grandma ended up moving upstate, where she took a second husband. She died before my dad turned 18, some say of a broken heart, and the man she married stepped up and raised her kids like his own until they were all ready to fly the nest. I never got the chance to meet the man. Heck, I never got a chance to meet my grandma or grandpa, but if I did, I'd shake the man's hand for stepping up and being the father my own grandpa should have been. Because despite all he'd lived through, my dad turned out to be a pretty okay guy, and I miss him very much. So this is kind of an old one, and nothing to do with me really, but I think you'll enjoy it because it's a good one. So I didn't know this until I was like 20-something, but it turns out I'm descended from a man named John Stratton, who was part of the first wave of Americans to come over. Now, it's all total word of mouth, like it isn't even in any history books as far as I know anyway, but the story goes that he arrived with his family in 1610, right around the time the colony was set to be abandoned because everyone was starving. He sailed on a relief ship commanded by a guy called Baron de la Warre, who the state of Delaware is named after, and their arrival was hugely celebrated because it meant the colony could keep going. But my forefather, being a deeply religious man, didn't think much of the colony at all. He sent for his family not long after he'd secured a home for himself, but I guess he was always planning on leaving, because while he was waiting for them to arrive, he went around recruiting a bunch of other like-minded religious types to form a sort of breakaway colony. When his family arrived, John pulled the trigger and announced that he, his family, and several others were headed out into the wilderness to form a village of their own, one that would actually obey God's laws instead of flouting them like they did in Jamestown. I guess I do kind of see things from his perspective too, because Jamestown docks were basically a haven for all kinds of scumbag pirates, not to mention the working girls who served them. So if he was super religious like he was, it figures he got sick of it and decided to leave. Now anyways, so John and the other Puritan families left Jamestown sometime in 1611 and made their way into the woods until they found a clearing that'd make a good space for a small village. They built everything from the ground up, and then within a couple of years, the village was thriving. They'd hauled timber and animal skins back to Jamestown to trade for other goods, but aside from that, they didn't want anything to do with them. They lived by the Bible's laws and used it like a kind of early game constitution, citing its verses whenever they needed a solution to a problem or needed to resolve a conflict. So, time goes by, and something like 10 years after the village was founded, John Stratton was calling himself a minister and was basically the village patriarch who guided his flock in all manners, both earthly and heavenly. But from what I can gather, he had two major problems. The first were the natives, because by 1620, relations had worsened dramatically and it seemed like war between themselves and the settlers was coming no matter what. But the second of John's two problems came in the form of his own flesh and blood. John had around 9 sons and daughters, and they're just the ones who survived. And while the majority of them honored their mother and father, like the Bible told them to, one of them wasn't nearly so unquestionably obedient. And to me, Thomas Stratton sounds like a lot like your average teenager these days. He thought the village was boring and lame, and he wanted to go back to Jamestown, and all he had to do was hunt, smoke tobacco, and go walking with his village crush, the girl he wanted to marry. But on the other hand, his dad either wanted him in church or in the fields and said he was too young and cocky to be a hunter without hurting either himself or someone else. But as you can imagine, this wasn't what young Thomas wanted to hear, and he disobeyed his dad more than once by heading out into the woods and trying to catch deer without permission. John forgave his son for the first time he caught him, but he warned him not to do it again. Then when he did and showed a complete disregard for his dad's wishes, John Stratton decided to make an example of his son. Thomas was still only 14 or 15 at this time, so John had no problem dragging him into the small village square and holding his son down while he dragged down his pants. He then spanked his boy, like spanked his bare ass in front of everyone while quoting lines from Proverbs. "Whoever spares the rod hates his son, but he who loves him is diligent to discipline him." And train up a child in the way he should go, even when he is told he will not depart from it. I guess John figured that this would fix his boy and that public humiliation would make him think twice about being disobedient in the future. But as most of y'all can probably guess, it didn't do anything of the sort. Being publicly shamed and spanked made Thomas hate his father. I mean, go figure, right? But he went from some happy-go-lucky rebellious teenager to open defiance, returning the shows of public humiliation on a daily basis by refusing any command that John saw fit to give him. Thomas refused to even hunt when given direction, and would wait until his dad asked him to do something else before grabbing his musket and heading off into the woods with the family's hunting dog. And this kept going on for years, with John getting angrier and angrier and despairing over what to do with young Thomas. But by that time, Thomas was basically a grown-ass man, one who could use a musket really well and couldn't be dragged into the town square for a spanking. John waited years hoping his son's rebellious streak would disappear if he just ignored it. But when Thomas finally announced he was leaving the village and was returning not just to Jamestown, but to England, John decided that was not going to happen. The night before Thomas was due to leave for Jamestown, his father gave the impression that he'd accepted it, but was still sad to see him leave. John and Thomas had a little heart-to-heart about how the younger of them needed to make his own way in life, and I'm guessing they must have done the 1600s version of hugging it out, because when Thomas went to bed that night, he didn't suspect a thing. Meanwhile, once Thomas is asleep, his dad goes round and rounds up all the men in the village who were ride or die loyal to him. And then they snuck into Thomas's bedroom, dragged him out of bed, and beat the living crap out of him till he was either out cold or punch drunk enough to drag him off into the woods without him trying to fight. They dragged him out to a spot that John had spent some time the previous day. But while he claimed that he was only going into the woods to talk God, he'd also been mighty busy digging a big old pit that they threw Thomas into when they arrived. John and his buddies then went about burying Thomas up to his chest in soil, and then by the time his senses returned to him, his hands were tied and it was too late to do anything but struggle against the weight of all that soil. Thomas begged his father to let him go, but all John did was quote a verse from Deuteronomy, and the one about what to do with rebellious children. And for the sake of the story, I'll just copy and paste the most relevant parts so you all have an idea of the last things Thomas heard. Bring him out to the elders of his city at the gate of a place where he lives, and they shall say to the elders of his city, This is our son, stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey our voice. He is a glutton and a drunkard. Then all the men of the city shall stone him to death with stones. So you shall purge the evil from your midst, so that all the people will hear and fear. After that, when John was done explaining himself to his son, he and his buddies picked up the rocks that they'd piled in a wide circle around the hole. Then they started throwing them at the boy as hard as they could. They smashed the boy's head into a bloody pulp, and they didn't stop until they were absolutely certain he was dead. And then, according to the story, they dug the hole out a little more, laid him in what had always been intended as a grave, then piled the earth on top of him again and walked back to the village. John told everyone that Thomas had left early that morning, and that he'd wished him well on the road back to Jamestown. I don't know exactly how it happened, but the truth got out somehow. My great-aunt Kathy says that she was told that some wild dogs dug Thomas's body up and a hunter found pieces of him all over the woods. But my mom says that she heard it differently, and that John actually confessed to his wife about what he'd done, who reassured him that he'd done the right thing. Either way, John almost completely got away with it, and if it wasn't for one of his other sons who let everyone know what had happened to poor Thomas, I don't think anyone would have ever found out the truth. Things went on as normal for a year or so, and then remember I said about relations between the natives and the settlers breaking down? Well, apparently in 1622 the natives got sick of the tobacco farmers encroaching on their lands, and they went on a major killing spree, burning down whole villages and slaughtering anyone who lived there. And yeah, you guessed it, John Stratton's little religious fiefdom was one of those villages. And if it wasn't for our ancestor escaping with his scalp to Jamestown, I most probably wouldn't be around to write this and keep the story alive of what a piece of human garbage he was for murdering his own son.